everyone. And welcome to everyone who's joining us on the live stream too. We're so pleased that you could come and be a part of the launch of this really special book this evening. It's going out into a world where I think it's going to be a part of children and young people's lives in Scotland for a long time. I'm Eleanor Collins. I'm editorial director at Floris Books. We're here tonight to listen to Amina Shah, Scotland's National Librarian, and Theresa Breslin, one of Scotland's foremost writers for children. I will be very brief. I will shortly hand over to Amina. She will introduce Theresa. We will hear Theresa reading from the book, and we will hear Amina and Theresa's discussions of the book. There will be a chance to ask questions, so if you have any questions, keep them in your head. And there will be a chance to buy the beautiful book at the end. It is at a discount tonight. The library's offering a discount on the book, and you can get the book signed on its launch night. Last week, perhaps Britain's greatest writer of history in the form of fiction for adults died. I heard the news on Friday morning, and I was a bit jangled. I felt moved for Hilary Mantel and her family and friends, but unable to settle my thoughts. So I was grateful that when I was driving later that evening, Radio 4 were replaying Hilary Mantel's first Wreath lecture. I really recommend it to you. It's on BBC Sounds, if anyone would like to catch up with it. In that lecture, Hilary Mantel quotes the 19th century historian Lord Macaulay. Lord Macaulay said, "History has to be burned into the imagination before it can be received by the reason." In other words, paradoxically perhaps, we have to be moved by historical events and connect personally to historical figures before we can understand that the past is real as our present, and the greatest influence upon it. This brand new book, breaking into our present today, is perfectly formed to burn the history of Scotland into the imaginative lives of its children. It takes 10 of Scotland's monarchs and tells a story based on historical legend and record that brings each of them alive as full characters. Theresa has brought her incredible gift for storytelling, which makes her folktale collection some of the best-loved Scottish books for children, together with her indefatigable research skills, as you might expect from a former librarian, to give us 10 formative moments in Scotland's past. All the joy of the tales, combined with the thrill of that sudden realization, this really happened, and it happened here. When they're strung together in chronological order with factual introductions and conclusions and connections between the stories, it turns out that she's written a history of Scotland's formation. We make many beautiful and special books each year at Floris, and I'm proud of each one. But I'm especially proud of the illustrated legends of Scotland's kings and queens, because it is a unique and ambitious book. It's not easy to make unique and ambitious books. I want to extend heartfelt thanks to the team at Floris for getting behind a project on this grander scale, only a bit over a millennium covered. Particular thanks to our senior designer, Richard Wainman, who was asked for historical authenticity and sumptuousness and has given both. And to Katie Lockwood-Holmes, publisher at Floris Books, for her confidence in the project, her careful thought, and her unerring ability to push at vital moments. Thank you too to Kirsten and Ali for organising the event tonight. Thank you to Amina and the National Library for hosting this event. It's so appropriate that we're in this place that preserves Scotland's written past and that provides the space and resources for its culture to be extended. It has been and continues to be an absolute privilege and pleasure to work with Theresa and her words. It's no exaggeration to say that no one else could have written this book. It draws upon a great depth of writerly experience and imagining. In this rich present moment, when we experience one monarch giving way to another, as they have for over 1,000 years, we feel how a view through kings and queens allows us to imagine and arrange past centuries of human life in our own minds. Theresa, this is an amazing gift for Scotland's children.
Such a lovely start, and welcome everyone to the National Library of Scotland. As Eleanor said, my name is Amina Shah, and I am so delighted to be here this evening with Theresa. This is our first joint event, which is a hybrid event. So it's you're all here in the room, but we also have people at home on YouTube so that we can maximise the audience, as so many people were keen to hear from Theresa. And before we talk about the book, I just wanted to say why I was so delighted that Theresa was coming is because Theresa has known me my entire life. Her and my mum were good friends, met when they were 17 in the libraries. And this is Theresa's 50th book, and which is just unbelievable. And I'm going to read out your biography, if you don't mind, because I don't want to miss a single bit of it. So Theresa is critically acclaimed popular author of over 50 books for all ages, whose work has appeared on stage, TV and radio, and is translated worldwide. Titles encompass most genres and formats, from picture books to the beautifully illustrated treasury of Scottish folk and fairy tales, to historical novels such as Remembrance and Divided City, which I remember when that came out. It was such an important book. She also writes comedy, humorous stories, fantasy, adventures, dyslexia-friendly books, English as additional language text, short stories, plays and articles. She won the Carnegie Medal, the UK's most prestigious award in children's literature, for Whispers in the Graveyard, and recognition of her work includes many book prizes, the Scottish Book Trust Outstanding Achievement Award included. She's an honorary fellow of the Association for Scottish Literary Studies and was a previous president of SILIPS, the Library and Information Professional Organisation. And in the Queen's Birthday Honours, was this just last year, Theresa was appointed O.B.E. for services to literature. A former professional librarian, she's an active advocate for literacy, literature and libraries. I know all that to be so true, and what an imagination as well, Theresa, to be able to produce this really beautiful book. So, this is your 50th one. Yeah. How does that feel?
I can't believe it myself, actually. But I'm glad this is this one, because it is, as Eleanor says, very special, yes. And I have to say, right from the beginning just now, it wouldn't be so special if it wasn't for the Team Floris, from everyone. I did feel at one point, one of the manuscripts came back and there was names all over it, like, you know, the Katie and Suzanne and Richard and Eleanor and Kirsten and Ali, and I thought, goodness me, there's so many people behind this book. I thought, I almost expected the coffee shop across the road that's serving the bagels in the morning. Essentials in the morning. Yeah, so really, it wouldn't be here without them, actually, and it wouldn't have some of the finesses. One of the things to look at if you're looking at the book is the timeline.
Yes.
Which really. What would it say? Blood, tears, sweat, and swears on that on the timeline. Yes.
And for those of you who haven't had a chance to look at it yet, Theresa's book has this amazing timeline of kings and queens of Scotland and people who have a relationship with Scotland. And what I loved about that was you've picked out 10 stories here, and it's facts. It's things that happened in real life, but you also have a story alongside it just to bring it to life, which is what makes it so accessible for children and also for adults like me who need to swat up on the Kenneth McAlpine and Lady Macbeth. It was so great to see that timeline and it presented in that way.
I think it was worth the effort eventually. It was worth the effort. It was.
Well, Theresa, could I ask you to read one of your favourites from these 10 stories?
This was a hard decision when I knew that I was asked to do this because they're all my favourites really. But it's called Kings and Queens, and just by the way history and the way society was, there are somewhat less, fewer queens than there are kings. So I will read from. This one's called Queen Margaret and the Perfect Peril. And as a short introduction to why we eventually did have a queen called Margaret. This came about because when William the Conqueror invaded England, the young prince who could have been king, and his mother and his 2 sisters came to shelter at the court of King Malcolm III of Scotland. And one of these, the princesses, was a girl called Margaret. And Margaret means a peril, and she was like her peril. She was generous, she was, graceful, beautiful, and with great integrity. So it's no wonder then that Malcolm fell deeply in love with her, and they were soon married. Malcolm adored Margaret, and so did the Scottish people, for she tended the sick, she served orphans from her own table, she taught local children to read. And when he saw that she was really passionate about reading, especially religious texts, he had made for her, this part is true, this is totally true, they had made for her a special book of illuminated manuscripts, and it's embellished, gold leaf, etc., etc. And it's still there's a copy in the Bodleian Library, and this is where I mix legend with fact in that it is supposed to have fallen in water and was rescued intact; it hadn't been damaged. I added a bit, as well as the gold leaf. There was a single large freshwater pearl from the River Forth, and she treasured this book and she kept it always with her. Now, at that time, the Scottish court was in Dunfermline, but more and more business had been conducted from Edinburgh, and people had to go across, and also people were crossing the Forth to go to visit the shrines at St Andrews as well. And Malcolm decided he would build a little chapel at the top of the castle rock for his wife, because she was very devout. And she decided one day that she would come and look at it. So on a blustery day, when the royal party reached the jetty on the north side of the river, this is because this part was too wide for the bridge, many people were waiting to hire a boatman. Families go to Edinburgh to work, Malcolm explained. Traders bring goods to sell, pilgrims journey to the sacred shrine in St Andrews. Margaret's mind was troubled as she and her husband boarded the royal ferry boat. Their craft was stoutly built, with a proper sail and strong oarsmen to pull through the deadly currents from the North Sea. Yet to her, the various sailing and rowing boats bobbing around in the swirling water seemed fragile and easy prey to the wind or tides. "Come, dear wife, shelter beneath the awning." Malcolm glanced at the gathering grey clouds. "There's a squall blowing in." The Queen shook her head and went to stand in the prow of the boat. The other boats were hurrying to the shore, except for one, which was already midway in the Firth, battling against the ever-increasing wind. "Look!" Margaret pointed in alarm. "That little boat is being swept out to sea." The King frowned. "It's taking on water fast. I fear they'll be swamped. There's nothing we can do." "My husband, please," the Queen begged him. "For pity's sake, it's a family. A father and a mother are on the boat. Listen, their baby in the basket is calling out for help." And it was true. The wailing of the infant sounded above the howl of the gale. "Woman," King Malcolm grunted, "the sea is too choppy for us to change course. The oarsmen would be slow to follow my order anyway. You would have us all drowned." But the sailors in the royal ferry boat revered their Queen. She nursed her children when they were ill. She gave alms to the needy. So even as the King was speaking, the coxswain had drummed the signal. The oarsmen bent to their task and with supreme effort swung the royal ferry boat to face into the teeth of the storm. Minutes passed before they drew alongside the small craft struggling in the mounting waves. Sweat was running down the father's brow as he desperately sculled his oars. The mother was frantically bailing water while the child sobbed in terror. "We have them," Margaret cried in relief. And then suddenly, the little boat overturned. The mother and father could swim, but the basket containing the baby floated away. Margaret screamed, "The baby! The baby!" Within seconds, the coxswain had lashed a rope to his waist and dived into the water. Both Margaret and Malcolm gripped the rope as the sailor, floundering, tried to catch the basket. "Heaven, help us!" implored Margaret. Malcolm marked directions, and with a final surge of effort, the coxswain grabbed the basket and tossed it onto the deck. With no care for her rich garments, Margaret lifted the sodden infant and cradled him on her knee. The mother and father were dragged on board, while Margaret wrapped their child in her velvet cloak, cuddling close to keep him warm. Clad in dry clothes, the parents huddled under the awning. Margaret gave the baby to his mother, and then the Queen sat quietly until the royal ferry boat docked at the jetty on the Edinburgh side of the river. Onlookers who'd witnessed the brave rescue cheered loudly. Queen Margaret stood and raised her hand in the air. Everyone fell silent. They saw that the Queen was showing them her most precious possession, the ornately bound book with its exquisite cover of fine leather, decorated in gold leaf and studded with large freshwater pearl. With firm fingers, Margaret grasped the pearl and wrenched it from its setting. She held the perfect jewel aloft and spoke in a clear voice. "This pearl is a bounty from the River Forth. It was given to me as a gift, and now I will give back something more valuable to the river and to Scotland. My pearl will be sold to earn money to build a sturdy, seaworthy ferry boat. It will carry those who wish to travel across the Firth of Forth." She was true to her word. To keep people and pilgrims safe, Queen Margaret established a public ferry service just beyond Edinburgh on the mouth of the River Forth. It became known as the Queen's Ferry. Towns grew up at the jetties on either side of the Firth. They were called North Queensferry and South Queensferry, as they still are to this day. 150 years after her death, Margaret became the female patron saint of Scotland. Her official title is Queen St. Margaret of Scotland. Although in the country she made her own and where she earned much love and respect, they knew her as the Pearl of Scotland.
Such a lovely story. I think I really need to have a word with Richard Ovenden, the librarian at the Bodleian, about that book. Should be here. We need to repatriate that book.
Even for a little while. If I can just say, one of the great things that Floris did as well, because we were trying to think of introductions, there was lots of toing and froing about the book before I even started writing. And so then we had eventually transpired that we have before the legend and after the and beyond the legend. And one of the things that you'll see in the book is at the end, you know, there is a small vignette of, yes. Oh, there it's there, of Queen Margaret, which is the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh, you know, and amazing. It's part of Edinburgh Castle.
And just up the road here. I think that's something that really struck me about all these stories, that they have a relationship to places in Scotland. And even today, when I was, I live in Fife, and I was coming across the bridge and I was rereading the book and thinking, I had no idea about the story of North Queensferry, South Queensferry, and where that name came from, and just how amazing it is to spread those stories so that children have a more of an understanding of the history behind it all. Where did you get the idea, Theresa, to write this?
Again, all praise to Floris. I would say that when we were doing the folk and fairy tales, I did suggest, I think they might have eventually called it nagging them to. I remember being young and we had a book called Scotland's Story, and we had also, there was an abridged form of Scots Tales of a Grandfather as well in the house. And there were all these stories about Kate Barlass, Kate who barred the door, put her arm through the slots in the door. So some people are nodding, some people have heard of it. I think, yeah, you know, all these stories about, you know, everybody kind of knows, you don't kill a spider, remember Robert the Bruce, all these other ones, etc., etc. But then I had a meeting, Eleanor, the editor, asked me to come to a meeting because they were conceiving this idea. And I remember because you'd arrived in your bicycle, I think, we met in a cafe, and then I was walking back along with you along the gardens, Prince's Gardens, and you had said, you know, we were thinking of maybe 10 monarchs. Have I got the story correct, yes? And I was going, yes, of course, I would love to do that, I'd love to do this. And as I walked back, I thought, so 10 monarchs for 10 different parts of history that I would have to research. And you would have to have at least 1, 2, maybe 3 other characters in each story. So that's 40 characters in one book in batches of 10 who would have to be completely different from every other character at a completely different time. I thought, right, okay. So the drafting of it, yeah, took quite a while to pick. And then it was only as we were doing it, and I have to say, due to the resources of the National Library, who have got the most amazing resources, you know, and even the way the website works, you can look up a theme and it will tell you. So actually using the library triggered something else, and I thought, so there were very obvious ones, but then I thought, supposing we did them, you know, start with the very first and work our way through it. And really the book was, usually, you know, you've got it blocked out and then you're right, but this was different. I'm looking at the editor, it was, and looking at Richard as well, because, yes, and every member of Flora staff that are in here, it was different.
And was it during the time of COVID and lockdowns?
It was during the time of lockdown. I think in a way lockdown did help because as a writer, one of the things I didn't realise is that you're asked to go into schools quite a lot, or do book festivals, or do various things. So that stopped. You know, I did have to make little film clips for schools, especially, you know, Divided City, the one that you were mentioning. But no, that it helped, except I think that many people, I lost a bit of focus. You know, I remember doing a sort of call with teenagers, and I was saying, look, I'm lying in bed, or I'm getting up and in my pyjamas, and I'm not even a teenager. You know? And I thought, I need to get so I found that, so it was harder in some ways, but the time was there. Mm-hmm. You had the time, and you had to make best use of the time. And, you know, florists were working good. They were working from home, and they were in constant touch with it. Yeah.
And did any of the research throw up stories that surprised you? Because I was surprised about the story of Lady Macbeth, Queen Gruach, which is quite a different portrayal from Shakespeare's one.
Well, I hadn't realised this either. I knew that she'd had been, you know, for different, probably political reasons, that she was not as well regarded as she should be, shall we say this. But what I had, first of all, she had, and I'm sure there's someone in the audience here who knows Scottish history a little bit better than I do, no doubt correct me. She had a better claim to the throne than Duncan. She was, because it wasn't direct descendants, it was tanistry, which means that a brother could inherit or somebody could inherit. This resulted in people murdering each other in order to get the throne. So she had, and Macbeth had the same degree as Duncan's entitlement to the throne. So that threw up quite a lot. And then I discovered, again from the National Library, that they ruled for 17 years. And while they were ruling, they actually went on a pilgrimage to Rome, which meant that the country was stable enough for them to leave to do that, which I thought, that surprised me. That so they were, and then we had this little gem of a fact about about women being property and then not being able to inherit. I think there's a is there an illustration of Lady Macbeth? Does that come next? Maybe, yeah. I just love.
Yes.
I love the way she's got. I love the way the illustration. I mean, you saw the illustration of Margaret as a Saxon princess and then Lady Macbeth, who's holding her parchment to say, and this, of course, I've made this. This meant to be Macduff who's saying, you're not entitled. So I just love that illustration.
It's beautiful, and she has the best hair.
She has the
in
best
fact, everyone's hair in the whole book is really good. The illustrations are so vibrant. I love Robert the Bruce. He looks with his hair and his lion rampant.
There was detail on the hair, wasn't there? There was detail about the hair. The haircuts were discussed, changed, altered.
But I think it's so interesting that there's so many things that we just assume, we talk about in the library world, as you'll know, information and misinformation and, how that's so important, information literacy and truth-telling of archives and memory. But actually, there are quite a few things where it's been muddled in the past, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, it's just if you read the newspapers, if something happens in real life and then you read different versions in the newspapers or in social media, then you see. But what I think the National Library's treasure is that you can get back and read from someone who was actually there, who wrote. There's a famous one which we were discussing earlier called The Lion in Mourning, which is about Culloden, and it's a collection of materials or texts from people collected by someone, from people who are actually there.
It's phenomenal.
It's phenomenal.
It's so unfortunate that we're moving the exhibition at the moment, so it's not there for you to see. But it's just incredible when you actually see that. And of course, we've also got the Iona Psalter, and Iona is mentioned so much in here. And it was such an important place with the Stone of Destiny and all those connections.
Going to be moved, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Soon, yeah.
I know, it's so interesting. So myths and facts have merged quite, and I think you're going to read another story about Alexander. Mary.
Well, it's
Mary
just,
with the four Marys.
Well, I also think that we just felt that Mary had her ordeal because she was, she was a teenager when she had this responsibility. So we sort of decided on a story where she was happy when she was here and she met her four Marys.
And there's a song, isn't there, The Four Marys?
That's complete nonsense. Sorry, no, it's not. No, it says Mary Hamilton. There's no Mary Hamilton.
So that's another example.
That's another example.
Yeah, never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
There is slight evidence to say that it was something to do, believe it or not, to do with Russia. About that there was some. There's something about, because the woman is about to be executed the next day, so no, it's absolutely nothing to do. Somebody has thought that the syllables of Carmichael, Mary Carmichael, and me is fitted in. They thought, just slap that one in. That's my opinion. That's my opinion. But no, please, no.
So Alexander, tell us about him.
Yes, Alexander. Actually, when I was writing the book, I have to give a shout out as well, if they're watching, is to the yoga group, who did also keep me sane during the pandemic, because we were all on it, exchanging jokes, etc. But also the yoga guru, Marlon, who, based in Arran, was able to tell me couldn't see whether, if Alexander was defending Scotland from a Viking invasion, if they would be able to see the fires from the mainland of this huge Viking fleet that sailed up and sort of based himself all around Arran, ready to invade Scotland. So again, local research. Madeline looked this up for me locally and sent me back various pieces of information. But I think he got a raw deal as well. He's the one that people remember that he fell off his horse. And then we thought, yeah, I know, but he was very smart, and also he had sons. And there's also, if you like, when Mary, Queen of Scots, who inherited, had two brothers who died people don't know this. The children mysteriously died. Now, I know there were a lot of illnesses at the time, but if you were the heir to the throne, it's a bit like the princes in the tower, and the two heirs, you wonder. But the thing that I think about Alexander, and this is, so the fact is that the Vikings were invading the Western Isles and encroaching more and more and more, and he thought they were just going to invade Scotland, and he thought he would gather his army and whatever navy he had to repel it. And then they arrived. So this is King Haakon, who's subdued Iceland and Greenland with thousands of Viking warriors, and they sail up. So then there's just vague bits about what happened. But to me, reading it, he went to parley with him. He goes to parley with him. And I'll read you a little bit of the story there.
What does parley mean?
Parley means, he go, well, generally speaking, if you were being invaded, what you would do is you would go and say, well, look, I'll give you that wee bit and 5,000 crowns a year or something, and would you leave the rest of us alone? You were paying protection money. So he's 21 years old, Alexander, and he realises if they take the islands, then the jumping off point is the whole of Scotland. And so he takes his army and his navy, the small navy he has, and he goes to Largs. And he's on just a short reading. Are we all ready for time?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. No, definitely.
So it's King Alexander and the Viking invaders. If we engage in a naval battle with King Haakon, our ships will be utterly destroyed. Ross, the captain of Scotland's war council, spoke quietly with the king. With a heavy heart, King Alexander nodded. Captain Ross was an old, experienced warrior and a wise judge of this dire situation. The Scottish fleet was vastly outnumbered. The king and the captain were standing on the shore of the mainland looking across the firth to Arran, and from here the smoke rising above the campfires told them that the Vikings were gathering on the island to launch their attack. Your men are not afraid to fight, said Ross. It's a glorious thing to die for our country. Indeed it is, King Alexander responded, and yet, rather than seeking glory, sometimes a battle is better fought with guile. You're a canny lad, sire, said the captain, but it cannot be denied there are more of them than there are of us. Alexander bent and dipped his index finger in the water at his feet. He held it up, twisting it this way and that to test the direction of the wind. Then the young man grinned at Captain Ross. I'm minded to go to Arran under a flag of truce and suggest that we negotiate a peaceful solution. Well, with a big as force as he has, King Haakon has no need to negotiate, said the captain. What makes you think he'll accept your proposal to parley? Alexander pointed seawards. At the moment, neither the currents of the air nor those of the water favour the fleet. The Norsemen are expert sailors, and they will know this. Haakon suffers no disadvantage by talking to me. I'll attempt to convince him that we are weak and fearful and anxious to please. He might hope to lose fewer men and gain more taxes and territories by delaying his invasion. And what would we gain, sire? Captain Ross asked. Time, King Alexander replied. He glanced north to where the mountain tops were already sprinkled with early snow. We gain time. And so the two kings met. King Alexander put on a show of nervous confusion, stumbling through his speeches. He meekly offered money and goods, but he hadn't brought the seal of Scotland with him, so he couldn't stamp any treatment document. He promised to return the following week, whereupon he begged to revise the conditions. He spent days pondering words and phrases, pretending not to understand them. The terms of the treaty had to be explained over and over in fine detail. King Haakon was more than twice the age of Alexander, an able ruler with an exceptionally powerful navy, with which he'd crushed Iceland and Greenland. Confident that he could crush the upstart Scottish monarch whenever he chose, Haakon was in no hurry to mount his onslaught. And so the talks went on, and on, and on. So I think we're just going to use an illustration, because meanwhile Alexander is setting a trap for when the Vikings eventually decide enough is enough, and they're sneaking ashore. And all I'll say to you is I just match this with the legend that tells us why the thistle became the emblem of Scotland. You'll probably guess what happened.
I know, it's such a lovely link, and it's such a beautiful illustration, isn't it? And it's just, it's so interesting how knowledge of the land, knowledge of Scotland comes into play here. Just understand that sort of canny knowledge as well. It's really
a beautiful country. I think that was one of the things that happened with lockdown, because the country was so quiet. I don't know whether anyone else found this. And when it opened up, it was still quiet because people were travelling, so you could go places, even if you weren't allowed inside anywhere. When you were allowed to travel a little bit, you could go and you could see the interesting things, and how the castles and fantastic. And the treasures that we have here.
Absolutely. Well, you really sort of magically woven the story of Scotland through this. And interestingly, your timeline goes right up to Elizabeth II.
Yeah.
And of course, now, I suppose there's probably a lot of people, a lot of children who would be interested in sort of understanding more about that history and and the lines, etc.
That was difficult to decide what went in and what went out, and eventually we thought we would make it of the formation of the country.
Yes.
So the first Parliament, the first the treaty that released the Orkneys, that released the Western Isles, that then settled the border, which was always in dispute, and so until it actually became a country.
Yes.
And then, of course, the clearances and then the Crofting Act to sort of establish
exactly. It gives you the story of Scotland in a sense. And I loved as well the element we were talking about, Victoria and Albert come up to Scotland to get away from London after an incident, and that's when Balmoral was created. So it's so timely, I suppose, in terms of that understanding, which is really wonderful. Oh, thank you so much for bringing this into the world, which I'm sure will be loved for generations. Theresa, I'm sure that all of you, we've got some time for questions. I don't want to hog the conversation here, so just want to open it up to anyone in the room who has any questions for Theresa.
I've actually got an answer for someone, because people, I don't have an answer for a question that someone asked me. I'm hoping that, which if you want me to know the question that I cannot answer from the book, I'll let you know that. But I've got an answer for someone who very kindly, I don't know whether she wants me to mention her name, just nod your head or shake your head. No. Who was reading. I've got lots of lovely young people who read my books for me, and came back when Mary has been. The Scots are terribly defeated at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh, and Henry sends the army up to capture Mary Queen of Scots because he wants her to marry the young Prince Edward, and she's fleeing all around the country, and eventually she ends up in a little loch at Menteith, and somebody picked up and said, it's actually the Lake of Menteith. It's not. But then when I did the research, it wasn't called a lake until the 18th century, when somebody was doing the census was being done.
Oh, wow.
So that's why we have a lake in Scotland. So, but well spotted, apart from other things. This young lady spotted...
fantastic research.
Yeah, but fantastic knowledge of our country, and knew what was right and what was wrong.
I was wondering, Theresa, you said that there's not that many women, but actually it's almost equal in the stories, isn't it? There's 4 women,
yes,
and 4 queens and 5 men, and the way you've written some of the women is quite different, as we said about Lady Macbeth, for example, but some of the stories, you've written them to be really courageous and smart and empathetic, like Margaret. Was that purposeful? Did you have a theory to do that, or did that just come out?
I think that just came out. I think in order to exist like that, you would have to be like that. She came to Scotland. There was a time of huge change. There were still battles over the border, but she'd actually come from Hungary originally, the English monarchy. I'm more hazy on the English monarchy, but it wasn't a direct, it wasn't direct descendants. And William the Conqueror thought his, claim was legitimate as well. So she came to Scotland, which was completely different from what she had experienced or where she'd lived. And what is actually mentioned in the story, the thing about the reading was that most people couldn't read, even the kids. In fact, it was considered perhaps not the done thing to let, because that you had a scribe to do this for you. Why would you do that? It was maybe like sweeping your own floor or something like that. You'd a scribe to do that for you. Why would you do that? But she was very passionate about it. And there is this historical fact that she would take the children, probably children of the court, and try to encourage them to learn to read. And Malcolm couldn't read. And one of the reasons he had the book bound for her was they would sit at night and she would read to him, and he just loved to hear the words, as I think we all like to be read to. That hasn't changed over so many thousands of years. But she had to be, he was away quite often fighting battles, etc. So she had to run the country. And it was her who established the priory at Dunfermline, and then this was continued by her son David. So these abbey houses were, if you look at some of the ruins, they actually had, some of them had units for homeless people, believe it or not. These small sort of outbuildings with, almost like in shots with doors on them. It was a sort of forerunner of the National Health Service. They had massive herb gardens. They tended the sick, etc., etc. So she had a huge, I suppose you could say, civilising influence on the country as well. And it appears as though she was very gentle, very sweet, but with a will of steel if she was opposed by anybody.
Wow. And many of them are so young as well, aren't they? They're so young when they take up such a lot of responsibility. That is a really common theme.
Well, I think in particular of Mary coming back to Scotland as a teenager. And I think the problem, with Mary is that she didn't have a standing army. She didn't have a household guard. So she had to rely on the clan leaders to support her, and they were all jockeying for, I think nothing changes really. We're talking about, who would get this post and who would get that post, and you would support someone for whatever reason, etc. And she hadn't, so she had to sort of manage all this, and her life had been brought up to, literally someone dressed her. She would stand in the morning in these very complicated clothes that they wore, would have a dress, and then you would have separate sleeves. You would decide which sleeves you were putting on, and then these were either stitched or pinned in each day, so you changed your clothes according to the sleeves, or according to what you were doing. So then she came back to... But again, I think she's maligned as well, because she was an excellent horsewoman, and there are stories that you don't hear. The big row with John Knox, he stayed at Loch Leven, actually. She used to go there to hunt. She was using birds of prey, and he stayed a weekend there, and they had these theological discussions, which people... that's not in the book, because I think that's...
It's not that portrayed that way in modern times, is it? Yeah.
But he was pursuing a different agenda, I suppose.
Wow. It's so fascinating. We have a roving mic if there are any questions. Yes, one here at the front.
This is something that I very rarely reveal. It was at primary school in Pomedy. Do you know the legend? You must know it.
No, probably I don't know.
It was a primary school teacher who had said, did we know how Pomedy got its name? And we said no. And apparently Mary Queen of Scots had been galloping away, fighting with the armies, and the horse died under her. And the horse was called Paul, and it actually died, and she had said Paul May, which is Paul but dead, the name of the horse. So I thought you would have had that in there.
No, I'm sorry.
I mean, it was just one primary teacher. Sorry.
Send in your ideas for the second book, because it's in the series.
No, I have not heard that one. I have not heard that one at all.
Primary one it was, and it stuck in my head my whole life.
See, that's what I mean. A story,
Yes.
a story,
Yes.
a story stays in your brain, doesn't it? A story stays in your brain.
And the importance of learning these things when you're in school, when you're
Sticks
young.
in forever.
Yeah, and like you were saying with Hilary Mantel's story that you were saying earlier on, about sort of before you can reason about things, before you can understand, you have to know. It's like learning maths, isn't it? You have to know first
You know your tables.
before you can change. No, really interesting.
I love that quote, actually, Hilary Mantel. I love that quote about imagination as well. Yeah. She was quoting Macaulay. She said she was quoting Macaulay about the imagination. Yeah, and I think also then, if you're reading that, it becomes like that's a real incident in someone's life that they really existed. You know.
And see, when you look at manuscripts, I have the same feeling, and you'll know that in the library we've got Mary Queen of Scots' last letter.
Yeah.
And I actually was down at our amazing conservation studio with one of our colleagues was creating a special box for it, and I saw it, and it felt so incredibly moving because it was her hand. She'd actually written it, and you feel such a connection when you see something that somebody's touched. It's the same with the Lion in Mourning and all those things. That kind of connection to the story of the past, isn't it?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking of the person in the moment, actually writing that. One of the things that did happen over the years because of England invading and burning. Eventually, when Henry was so angry that they were hiding Mary from him, it just came up. It was called the Rough Wooing. It just came up, and as soon as he stepped in Scotland, he just burned everything, every castle, all the way up, and burned Holyrood Abbey. Just trying to find her. So a lot of our stuff was lost. A lot of the manuscripts were lost. So one of the things which I think that because Ireland and Scotland were quite closely connected at that time, there's a document called the Annals of Ulster, so it's got a lot of Scottish history in it. So what's in the library here are all sort of studies on the text. So even though you might not have the actual text, you will have someone who's translated it or who's commentaries on it, yes, and then relating it to Scottish history. There's the one, I'm trying to remember, it's called the Bruce, the one that was written after Bannockburn as well, yeah. So there's that as well.
Yeah, it's like tracing the past, solving a mystery with your research.
Actually, you should let people, how many miles of shelving are underneath
There's
it?
13 floors of shelving underneath your feet here. Yeah, 13 floors. And we have more at Causeway Side up the road as well, and film archive and everything. And of course it's growing and growing all the time. I think the latest is we have 57 million items.
I think you should do tours by candle, not candlelight, in case there's something awful.
Oh, not candlelight, no, the risk assessment wouldn't.
But seriously, well, you wouldn't need to be in the dark, wouldn't it? Because it would be in the dark.
It'd be dark anyway.
Yeah. But I really do.
And that's the interesting thing about the library, because we collect now, like you're saying, those things that you've researched at the time that people collect them, you don't know what's going to be important in the future. You don't necessarily know which items are going to unlock stories of the truth of what happened or anything else. So it's really interesting.
Very significant.
Yeah.
But just imagine that, it was 13 miles. And you could have sort of people in character hiding behind. Yeah. That would be so good. Take notes. Are you the best? Yeah, I absolutely think that would.
Can we sign you up for that, Theresa? You could be characters of these kings and queens.
I'll be leading Macbeth. Yeah, definitely. No, I just think that. Don't you think that would be good? Persuade her to do that. Would be absolutely brilliant. There'd be people queuing up. And that smell. When I worked at started with your mum in the libraries, yes. One of the things you had, you were in the branches, but you were also in the Mitchell, the old Mitchell Library, which was closed access at the time. It was mad, absolutely mad. People would come in and write out in a slip of paper, and then they put it in a thing called the dumb waiter, and it went up to one of the floors. So there were people sitting. It was a huge library as well, of course. And then you had to go and look for a book, which wasn't filed either alphabetically or by subject. It was filed by the date that come in. It got a number, so the first book was number 1 and the second book was number 2, so it could be completely different. It was mad. You had to go and look for a book with this piece of paper. But the smell, I love that smell of the old books.
I worked in the Mitchell in the 90s as well, in the late 90s, and they still had that system. And when I first started, I remember being lost all the time, because you would go into the stacks with your bit of paper to find the book, and then you would be stuck to find your way out. But you come across all these amazing things while you were there.
And then there was somebody working up there. I remember there was somebody working up there translating, and they just looked as though they'd been there for about, and they'd been left, you know, cleaning all the desk. It was fantastic. And there was also a thing, which is perhaps not relevant, but it was quite funny. So the Mitchell closed at 9 o'clock. So somebody always down at the front desk, because they were 4 floors down, they were out the door, and you were up on the 4th extension, because there was a big extension. It took you another 5 minutes to find your way out and get out, because the janitors didn't lock it till 10. So a request would come up about 9 minutes to 9. So the first time I was on, and I said, I need to go and find this book, and the person took it off me and said, let's look at it, because the front desk would send up a completely fictitious, name of reader, Feats McGurk, you know, Whittaker's Almanac for 1922, and you're going away, and it was like, give that to me. So if there was a person called Feats McGurk waiting for the Whittaker's Almanac 1922, decades ago, I'm sorry, but you never got it, because we decided it was the people on the front. So I'm presume that doesn't happen here, of course.
Of course not. Absolutely not. I think what we need to do next is collaborate on an archive of stories about libraries and all the stories of the past and the way it was and the way it is now, which is just so amazing. Well, Theresa, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for choosing the National Library of Scotland to put this book out into the world. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight. It's great to see you all. And to all of those people at home on YouTube, look out for our events programme. We have events in person, but we're also trialling having them online as well, so that we can get the best of both worlds and still reach out to people. And for those of you that are here, Theresa will be signing copies of the book outside in the shop. And for those of you at home, you can order copies of the book by going online on our website. Thank you so much. Theresa, can we just give Theresa a big round of applause? Thank you all.